and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'm continuing to blast through the nitrous oxide with the 2006 entry into the Fast and Furious franchise, Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, as directed this time around by newcomer to the fold, Justin Lin, who would actually go on to direct no less than 4 further entries in the series, and that is only at the time of this review. He is indeed tipped to be directing the final 10th instalment in the main series, which would indeed bring his grand total to a total of 6 movies, over half of the franchise itself. Again, of course, at the time of writing this review. So, as a disclaimer, I may give some spoilers for this film and others in the Fast and Furious series, as I have done previously. And so please do switch off now if you don't want to hear any of the plot details for these films, as thin as sometimes it can be. Please do come back though when you have watched all the films and do let me know what you have thought. I am always indeed very interested to know. So, now this film is somewhat unique in the franchise overall, as at the time it was released it had no connection to the previous movies at all. It went out and did its own thing. None of the original cast members returned to reprise their roles in any big way, and so the filmmakers set out to take the franchise in a new direction, focusing on a subculture of street racing known as drifting, bringing in a whole new story, cast and characters, which at the time was not a popular move amongst the fans, and dare I say it, including myself. I wasn't a fan of the direction this movie took, and I was one of those that avoided seeing it at the cinema. But I must say that it is one that has grown on me over time, and I think, like many, as this film has been given more kind of input into the franchise as time has progressed, even if, albeit retrospectively, a new appreciation for its subtleties and execution has formed in me. And I am not ashamed to say that I now do hold this entry in fairly high regard. So okay, it's not like any of the other entries at all. And it's quite a hard pill to swallow, especially as it appears to have no continuity at all. If indeed you watch the films in order they were released, in fact it hardly feels like a Fast and Furious movie on it, on its own accords. But, and this is a big but, I think it has quite a lot going for it. In that even I missed being kind of blinkered to the expectation of something this film never really tried to be, if you see what I mean. The movie introduces us to Sean Boswell, as played by Lucas Black, a wayward American high school teen who has a thirst for racing, a need for speed, if you will, but with little self-control, and often finds himself on the wrong side of the law. One race too many sees him shipped off to live with his estranged dad in Tokyo, Japan, in a last-ditch attempt to keep him from actually going into prison. However, it takes him all but 5 minutes to find the underground street racing scene. However, in Tokyo, racing is big business, but it isn't all about speed. Indeed, drifting is all the rage, and Sean quickly realises to get out on top, he will need to master this new and exciting technique. His American muscle isn't going to quite cut it out there. However, this new life leads him into the crosshairs of wannabe Yakuza hoodlum, so like the Japanese mafia, I think, Takeshi, as played by Bryan T. After Sean takes an interest in Takeshi's girl, Neela, as played by Nathalie Kelley. Together with his new friends, Han Lu, as played by Sung Kang, and Twinkie, as played by Bow Wow, Sean must master the art of drifting in order to prove he can't beat Takeshi, or he can beat Takeshi even, at his own game, and ultimately earn the respect and honour which will keep him and his friends safe. Now, this movie does come from a time when the franchise had little in the way of an overall master plan. They didn't think it would get as long as run as it did, nor be as successful, and so the efforts with this were to simply produce a movie about racing, and indeed a subculture at that. However, over time, with each new instalment, although they could have simply chose to ignore this movie or even completely retcon it, altogether, given that indeed it is considered the least successful in the franchise. They didn't. And ingeniously, they found a way to tie it into the main franchise on a number of levels. Indeed, this film actually almost becomes the linchpin, if you like, to the series that then follows. Which for me is why this film works so well now, you know, when perhaps I really did have misgivings with it, kind of when I first watched it. The thing is, even the 4th and the 5th installments don't really mention it or use it in any way, in any great big shakes. It isn't actually until the 6th installment they let the penny drop. And with, you know, with one swift click of their fingers, the sudden realization sets in that the 4th, 5th and 6th movies have all been prequels, set between the 2nd and the 3rd movies, complicating the series timeline somewhat, but in the same instance, giving this movie new purpose and much needed recognition. I won't say much more here in this respect. I will leave that something for later reviews as I'm going along. But needless to say, in the end, this film does connect into the main franchise. But moving on, this film specifically has a distinctly different vibe to other movies in the franchise. And certainly what we've kind of seen up to that point, you know. We'd already had 2 fairly different movies. So a third, yeah, didn't seem too far out to have something with a different style. Firstly, this is technically a high school come underdog story, which indeed were quite popular at the time. But following the kind of bright and breezy 2nd installment, this movie brought a more solid, darker tone and more of a character study, focusing squarely on its main character throughout. Lyn's first true outing in this franchise, it feels raw, a bit more jagged, but still chocked full of fantastic race set pieces. We do have a fairly simplistic plot, however. It doesn't set out to be anything too over the top. Even when we do get a drug lord, this time around, we race for honour and for respect, making this feel a lot more grounded in its approach and kind of stripping things back to a more basic framework. It is, in fact, the least in-your-face entry in the franchise, and in this respect, it can feel a little lacklustre. And you would be right. There are no grand theatrics here at all. No grand stunts. But what we do get is a very real and insightful depiction of another culture. At least from the point of view of a foreigner looking in and being laced right in the middle of this new and often daunting new environment. It is the only movie in the franchise, I believe, to date to give another culture anything more than just a passing glance, and how such a culture is impacted upon and felt by an outsider, reflecting any such culture in the world, you know? We have some amazing shots of Tokyo, and not just the glitz and the glamour, but the cramped conditions, living on top of your neighbour, and glimpses of other cultural aspects as we go. It can be very subtle in its approach here, but when you really think about it, it does actually give a lot more, much more than the races themselves. Culture, family, coming of age, you know? Seen entering this different culture, both in terms of the different racing techniques and indeed his life, is interesting on its own merits. And the movie has fun with that concept when you really just kind of sit and let that be absorbed, you know? Notably, we also have the introduction of Han as a character within the franchise, the only such character from this movie to have a prominent reoccurring role in future installments. Although, I am of the understanding that a number of other characters, including Scene and Twinkie, will be reprising the roles in the 9th installment in the main franchise, F9 The Fast Saga, which I will be reviewing at the end of this series. So definitely stay tuned to the channel for that. It will certainly be interesting to see how these characters have been further developed following the significant step in time from this to the latest instalment. Both in terms of the series, but also in terms of, you know, their future, their age and things. But anyway. It was interesting to see Han's character here, though. Knowing, of course, what we know from later installments. And then looking back, it was indeed intriguing to feel a story develop for his character, when in actual fact there perhaps wasn't one conceived at the time this movie was made. He had a certain kind of mysterious quality which worked well with a number of possible scenarios. So indeed, it still does fit quite well, you know? In terms of the lead, at first I really didn't like Lucas Black for the role. But the more you watch it, I think the more he has that kind of certain charm that really is just right for the character. His performance could have been a bit stronger to carry the character further, but I think he added kind of like a cheekiness that worked well to kind of fit with his kind of supposed bravado, you know? Overall, if you go into this movie expecting your typical Fast and the Furious, then you will be disappointed. This entry kind of travels down a different path, and even I would admit that at first it perhaps doesn't seem a worthy entry, but it more than deserves a repeat viewing, and certainly with the context of the entire series, and indeed, even if only from a break from the over-the-top outrageous nature of the later entries. As good as they are, this one keeps things low-key, and in the end, I've actually learnt to kind of appreciate that, all things considered, you know? Justin Lin's take is pretty deep, and perhaps for what it was trying to convey, it didn't go deep enough. It still wanted to walk in the racing world, you know, and rightly so. But I think some of its key themes did kind of feel somewhat undeveloped. It wasn't as poignant as perhaps it could have been, especially with respect to Sheen's character. Sheen's character. Is it Sean or Sheen? I keep saying Sheen, don't I? Relationship with his father, which was meaningful enough. We understand the complexities of this situation, but it wasn't explored in as much depth as it could have been. The movie has a fairly thin and uninspired story. I mean, the only thing that it has for a plot is Sheen learning to drift. But over time, I have gone from boring to understated in my opinion of its execution, you know? So I have kind of flipped and flopped a little bit. The lack of plot does mean you feel the movie's runtime. That I still agree. But it does its own thing. It has its own style. And it goes full throttle with it. Knowing it was standing its ground, you know? It is very much about the races and Sheen's journey. Keeping it simple but honest, and very down to earth. Definitely no grand plot, just a simple need to race and be faster than the other guy. By the end, you do have to wonder how anybody gets around in Tokyo, you know, if all they ever do is drive sideways. But it seems to work. Most certainly, you know, in the end, a film that really does deserve a second chance. And I'm so glad that I have come to love this for what it is. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions, and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you here at SciFirst MovieTalk, and definitely love to have you back. But most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.